In January of 1967, 3 American astronauts sat down inside a spacecraft on a launch pad in Florida for what NASA considered a routine, low-risk rehearsal. No fuel in the rocket beneath them, no countdown to actual liftoff, just a test. 17 seconds after a spark ignited inside that capsule, all 3 men were dead, and NASA's own internal paperwork would later prove they'd been warned this could happen months before it did. This is the story of Apollo 1, and the design flaw everyone saw coming. By the mid-1960s, NASA had run through Mercury and was deep into Gemini, testing everything from spacewalks to orbital docking, all in preparation for the real objective, landing a man on the moon before the decade was out, exactly as President Kennedy had promised in 1961. Apollo was the next step, and it needed to fly soon. The first crewed mission, officially designated AS-204 but known to the crew and the public as Apollo 1, was scheduled to launch in late February 1967. Before that, the spacecraft had to pass a full dress rehearsal, called a plugs-out test, simulating the entire countdown sequence with the capsule running on its own internal power, exactly as it would during a real launch, except sitting motionless on Pad 34 at Cape Kennedy, with no propellant loaded into the spacecraft itself. NASA had rated this test as carrying no fire risk at all. The 3 men climbing into that capsule on January 27th were not rookies chosen at random. Gus Grissom was one of the original Mercury 7, the second American ever to fly in space, and the commander who would have led this first Apollo mission into orbit. Ed White was already a national name. In 1965, during Gemini 4, he'd become the first American to walk in space, and the photographs of him floating above Earth had run in newspapers everywhere. Roger Chaffee was the only rookie of the 3, a Navy officer chosen specifically for this mission, about to fly for the first time. This wasn't a training crew, this was NASA's best, preparing to open the Apollo program. Here is the detail that matters more than almost anything else in this story. Inside that capsule, the atmosphere wasn't a normal air mixture. It was pure oxygen, and during ground tests like this one, it was pressurized to nearly 17 pounds per square inch, higher than the pressure of the air outside the capsule, and far higher than the low-pressure pure oxygen the crew would breathe once actually in space. NASA had chosen pure oxygen for the spacecraft for good engineering reasons. It simplified the life support system, reduced weight, and had worked without incident throughout Mercury and Gemini, but those missions used oxygen at low pressure, in space. Nobody had fully accounted for what pure oxygen does at high pressure, in an enclosed cabin, surrounded by flammable material, because on the ground, before launch, almost nothing was supposed to be able to ignite it in the first place, except the cabin was full of things that could burn. Velcro, used everywhere to hold down loose equipment, nylon netting, foam padding beneath the astronauts' couches, untreated aluminum tubing carrying a coolant made of a water glycol solution, a substance that, under normal conditions, doesn't burn, but that engineers would later discover becomes flammable in a high-pressure, pure oxygen environment. And running through, under and around all of it, literal miles of wiring, some of it already flagged internally, months earlier, for damaged and abraded insulation. Grissom himself had grown frustrated with the spacecraft's problems in the weeks leading up to the test. Communication systems had failed repeatedly during simulations. At one point, annoyed by a broken microphone link between the capsule and the control room, he made his frustration with the aircraft's readiness known to the ground team, half joking, half not, about how they were supposed to reach the moon if 2 buildings a few hundred feet apart couldn't even talk to each other reliably. That comment would later be quoted constantly, not because it was dramatic, but because it captured exactly how unfinished this spacecraft still felt, 5 weeks before it was supposed to fly. The test on January 27th started in the early afternoon and dragged on for hours, plagued by exactly the kind of communication glitches Grissom had complained about. There was also, at one point, a strange sour smell reported in the oxygen loop, investigated, and ultimately dismissed as not serious enough to stop the test. By 6:30 in the evening, the crew had been sealed inside the capsule, on their backs, wired into a pure oxygen atmosphere for more than 5 hours. At 6:31 p.m., a crew member's voice came over the radio reporting a fire inside the cabin. What happened in the next few seconds happened faster than anyone monitoring the test could process. In a sealed environment of high-pressure pure oxygen, a spark that would have caused a small, containable flame in ordinary air instead triggered something closer to an explosion. Investigators would later conclude the most likely ignition point was a damaged section of wiring near the environmental control unit, close to that flammable coolant line, a spark jumping from exposed, chafed wire insulation, in exactly the kind of location engineers had flagged as a risk before the fire, without it ever being fixed. Flames spread across the cabin in seconds, not minutes. The intense heat caused the air inside to expand so violently that the capsule's internal pressure spiked and ruptured the spacecraft's outer wall, venting flame and toxic gas outward toward the pad workers rushing to help, which, horrifically, slowed down the rescue rather than speeding it up. And then there was the hatch. Apollo's hatch design was not a simple door. It was a complex, multi-layered system, an inner hatch, a heat shield hatch, and an outer boost protective cover hatch, secured by a series of latches that had to be released by hand, in sequence, using a ratchet mechanism. It opened inward, specifically because an inward opening design couldn't be blown open by internal cabin pressure during flight, a safety decision made in direct response to an earlier Mercury mission where an outward hatch had blown open prematurely. Under ideal, calm conditions, opening this hatch took the ground crew roughly 90 seconds. On January 27th, with smoke, heat, and the same internal pressure spike that had already ruptured the capsule wall working against them, it took even longer. By the time pad workers finally forced their way in, the fire had burned itself out, and toxic combustion gases, not just the flames themselves, had already taken all 3 astronauts' lives within roughly the first 30 seconds. NASA's public statement that night was careful, measured, and deliberately thin on detail. Internally, it was a different story entirely. Engineers and safety officers began comparing notes almost immediately, and some of what surfaced was damning. The flammability risks of the pure oxygen environment weren't a total surprise. They'd been discussed, informally, in engineering circles for months. The wiring problems weren't news either, and most uncomfortably of all, a NASA quality control inspector at North American Aviation, the contractor building the Apollo command module, had submitted a report just weeks earlier describing what he called sloppy workmanship and inadequate quality control on the production line, loose debris left inside spacecraft components, wiring installed without proper protection, and a general culture of rushing to meet deadlines. That inspector, Thomas Barron, would go on to testify before Congress about exactly what he'd seen. His full, detailed report disappeared from NASA's records shortly afterward, and to this day, no complete copy has ever resurfaced, an unresolved detail that still fuels debate among historians about how much NASA and its contractor already knew. The fallout was immediate and public. Congress opened hearings within weeks, hauling NASA's senior leadership in front of both the Senate and the House to explain, on the record, what had gone wrong and who had known what and when. Apollo program manager Joseph Shea, who had personally pushed North American for months over what he considered an unacceptable number of unresolved technical issues on the spacecraft, was reportedly so affected by the deaths of 3 men he'd worked with closely that he was moved out of the program entirely in the months that followed. For an agency that had built its entire public identity on precision and competence, this was as close to a credibility collapse as NASA had ever faced. There were serious, quiet conversations in Washington about whether the Apollo program as designed should continue at all. It continued, but not unchanged. NASA's official review board, led by engineer Floyd Thompson, spent months producing a report that didn't spare the agency or its contractor. Their formal conclusion: this was not a freak accident. It was the predictable result of a spacecraft built with known, previously identified hazards that nobody had been forced to fix before a crew was sealed inside it. What followed was one of the most complete safety overhauls in the history of American engineering. The pure oxygen, high-pressure atmosphere used during ground tests was replaced with a nitrogen-oxygen mixture, chemically incapable of igniting the same way. Pure oxygen would still be used in flight, but only at the low pressure of actual spaceflight, where the original risk had never really applied in the first place. The hatch was completely redesigned to open outward, in a single motion, in under 3 seconds, no ratchets, no multi-stage sequence, no 90-second delay standing between an astronaut and survival. Flammable materials throughout the cabin were replaced, piece by piece, with self-extinguishing and fireproof alternatives, down to the Velcro and the fabric of the astronauts' own suits. Every wiring harness in the spacecraft was pulled, re-inspected, and in many cases rerouted entirely away from coolant lines and other ignition risks. The next crewed Apollo mission did not fly for 20 months. In that gap, NASA quietly flew 3 uncrewed test missions, Apollo 4, 5, and 6, to prove out the redesigned hardware and the massive Saturn V rocket before ever trusting another human crew to it again. When Apollo 7 finally launched in October of 1968, commanded by Wally Schirra, it flew in a spacecraft that had been rebuilt, system by system, specifically because of what had happened to Grissom, White, and Chaffee 18 months earlier. 10 months after that, in July of 1969, Apollo 11 landed on the Moon, inside a capsule that only existed in its safer form because 3 men had died, proving, in the worst possible way, exactly what still needed to be fixed. If a story like this is worth actually understanding, instead of just watching, subscribing genuinely helps me keep pulling these details together, instead of skimming past them the way most retellings do. There's a strange, quiet postscript to this story that most people never hear. Pad 34, where the fire happened, was never used for another crewed launch. NASA left it standing, deliberately, as a memorial, a rare thing for an agency that otherwise reused and repurposed almost everything. When Apollo 11's crew visited the pad shortly before their own launch in 1969, Neil Armstrong reportedly stood there in silence for a long moment before saying nothing at all needed to be said. The plaque that stands there today simply lists 3 names, 3 dates, and the words, "They gave their lives in service to their country." Apollo 1 never left the ground. But almost every safety system that got Apollo 11 to the Moon and back safely, the hatch, the atmosphere, the wiring, the materials, exists specifically because of the 17 seconds that killed its crew. NASA's greatest achievement was built, quite literally, on top of its worst failure. There's another NASA disaster where the exact same pattern repeats: internal warnings, ignored risk, a review board that found the agency knew more than it admitted, and once you see how closely it mirrors this one, it's hard to look away. That story is next.